Okay, let's talk about reproduction, and it's going to get kind of weird. So again, usually due to torsion, there's only one gonad. What type of gonad they have is going to depend on whether that species is hermaphroditic or dioecious. Dioecious species have two separate sexes, so they will either have an ovary or a testis, depending if they're female or male. But a lot of gastropods are hermaphroditic. They have a gonad called an ovotestis, which can produce both sperm and eggs. But it gets a little more complicated than just being hermaphroditic. Hermaphroditic species can be either simultaneous or sequential hermaphrodites. Simultaneous is just what it sounds like. They can produce both sperm and eggs at the same time. But in some species, an individual snail can start out as one sex and later switch sexes. So we call that sequential hermaphrodism. Depending on the species, they may make that switch when they get to a certain age or a certain size. So they may be males as small snails and then become females when they get older. But in other cases, it may be environmental conditions that trigger them to switch sexes. Here's an example of that, and again, you don't have to know this species, but it's just a cool example. So these are slipper shells, which may look like a clam, but they're actually a snail. They tend to stack themselves on top of each other, and it's actually their position in the stack that determines if they're male or female. The snails on the bottom of the stack tend to become females, and those on the top of the stack become males. They mate without leaving the stack. Males have long penises that they use to reach down to the females to inseminate them. Even though hermaphroditic snails can produce both eggs and sperm, and simultaneous hermaphrodites can produce both at the same time, they generally do not self-fertilize. So they need to have a mate and mate using sexual reproduction. In some species, they both exchange sperm. But in others, one snail functions as the male and one functions as the female. Females often have a structure called a seminal receptacle, which is a sperm storing organ. So they can mate with multiple males and hold on to that sperm until their eggs are ready to be fertilized. This is another way of increasing genetic diversity by mating with multiple other snails. Gastropods often have complex mating behaviors. There's a really great video of this linked here from the movie Microcosmos, a documentary about invertebrates and other small animals that I highly recommend. I got to see this in the theater as a kid when it came out in the 90s, and it's probably part of the reason I still love invertebrates so much now. These precopulatory behaviors may involve circling around each other, maybe nudging and tapping their shells together. Some species do dances where they wiggle their shells, maybe to show off how strong their muscles are, and often they also release chemical signals and exchange mucus. And here's a link for another really cool video from a BBC documentary with David Attenborough. This species has a really weird mating ritual that involves aerial acrobatics and entwining flower-like penises. Definitely recommend watching this, so feel free to pause and click on that from the lecture notes. But we're not done with weird snail sex yet. In some species, an organ in the vagina called the dart sac forms a sharp calcium carbonate harpoon called a dart or a love dart. During mating, one snail shoots its dart into the body wall of its mate. The dart releases chemicals into the mate's hemolymph that act like hormones. We're not entirely sure why they evolved this, but it's thought that those hormones are involved in sperm competition. Remember that snails often have a seminal receptacle, so they can store sperm from multiple mates. It's believed that these hormones increase the chances that that snail's sperm will fertilize the eggs in its mate, helping it compete with its mate's other mates.